then, of course, I think, well, who are we? Well, we're human animals. What makes us the kind of creatures that we are is our consciousness. That probably includes, I would say, consciousness of the world outside us, self-consciousness. It includes having projects that extend over time, having goals, having values, and so on. Now, a question might be, how do we persist through time, right? So philosophers like to talk about the question of what matters in survival. Now, that doesn't mean surviving death, but it means surviving from one moment to the next, right? So what makes you the same person from one act? As we all know, at any one moment, we have one act of consciousness, and then we have another that follows. What makes that part of the same thing, right? Somebody like Locke said, oh, it's our memory, the fact that we can recall having had thoughts earlier on and so forth. I think a lot of philosophers would now like to add extra things because, of course, our memories really aren't that good. And if we're relying on that, we're really not going to sustain ourselves very long over time. And so one might add, what makes you the person that you are over time is having similar values, or at least having values that change in a sort of gradual and identifiable way, and so forth and so on, right? Now, one of the things that I wanted to push with this line is the thought of a favorite philosopher of mine, Derek Parfit, who worked on personal identity. He poses a lot of thought experiments about division of selves. So suppose, for instance, that I have a terrible accident and part of my body is destroyed. Now, for some reason or other, perhaps there's a shortage of female philosophers, they decide to reconstitute me in two different bodies, right? And so now the question is, am I the one person, I am the other, am I both, or have I ceased to exist altogether? Parfit calls this an empty question because there's no further fact of the matter that we can learn about this particular thing. But it does seem as if it would be rational or sensible for me to care about both. And in a certain sense, I have expanded. Now I can do more. I can fulfill more projects. But I think that what that suggests is that what matters to survival is not uniqueness, that it's the very same thing, but it's other things, values that we have, intentions, experiences, and happiness. And one of the things that Parfit sees his view as doing is breaking down the barrier between subjects. So we come, in a certain sense, we can use this way of thinking to liberate us a little bit from the sort of egocentricity or egoism that we're all inevitably caught up in. And of course, that is also closely related to, I think, the Buddhist idea of the no-self, where realizing that the self, to some extent, is an illusion, will liberate us from a very narrow-minded focus on ourselves and us getting more and us being happy, and extending that out to other creatures.
That's fascinating. When I read this question, who are we, my mind went back to a different philosopher, namely Descartes, who said, I think, therefore I am, cogito ergo sum. And much of Western philosophy for the last 400 years has been, in a sense, footnotes to Descartes, including, obviously, Locke's very interesting discussion of personal identity. But again, my fear with that is that it's led us into a sort of rationalism, and that actually a Christian response, and Descartes was a devout Christian, I'm not saying he was a pagan or was denying the faith or anything, he was indulging in a thought experiment, which was also an experiment about thought and what you could deduce from the fact of thought. And I want to say again, at the risk of sounding like a cracked gramophone record, amor ergo sum, I am loved, therefore I am. And I put it that way rather than I love, therefore I am, though I would say that as well, because it seems to me that as humans, we discover who we are when somebody loves us or some creature loves us. It might be it might be a dog, it might be some other non-human creature who makes us feel more truly who we are, but ideally in some kind of a family or friendship or ecclesial or communal context, we discover who we are because of other people's love at whatever level. And it seems to me that has to do with the Christian idea, which in the nature of the case is not just a Christian idea but sheds light on other things, of being made in order to be part of a community, of discovering who we are within and for a community, because of course if you are loved, then the most natural thing to do is to love in return, and in turn to be part of that wider community of love. Now, one of the biblical phrases which sums up a lot of what it means to be human is a rather odd-sounding technical phrase called the Royal Priesthood. The priests and kings in the ancient world were the crucial mediators between the divine and the human, between the transcendent and the immanent or whatever. But in the book of Genesis, the idea of this hierarchy, these very few people in a society who mediate between God and the world, is democratized. And all humans are to be people who stand in between, at the convergence of heaven and earth, with heaven seen here not a la the Epicureans as a long way away, but a la the Jews as the thing which is the other dimension, which is mysterious, which is around us, and which actually desires to make its home with us, so that as Jesus taught us to pray, thy kingdom come on earth as in heaven. So for me, humans are discovering constantly who they are by loving and particularly by being loved, and in that process stand at the intersection of heaven and earth with responsibilities, as it were, in both directions. And the responsibility of caring for other creatures, which you approached in what you said through the Buddhist idea, I'm not quite sure how that emptying of self really works, but maybe you can say more about that. For me, it's more about actually discovering the extraordinary value of a self, but the paradoxical value, because the most important thing you can do with yourself is to give it away, and that is what love is all about.